Professor Salvatore Babones, Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatta, chair of today's webinar, and dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our very special webinar on India and the US, the tale of two democracies. Before we start, let me briefly introduce NICE. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflict are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To chair our very interesting topic for today, we have very distinguished scholar, Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt. Deepak Prakash Bhatt is a former elected member of House of Representatives at Federal Parliament of Nepal. He is member of International Affairs Committee of the Federal Parliament of Nepal. Dr. Bhatt holds Ph.D. from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Previously, he served as a member of high-level task force on returning Nepal's foreign policy, headed by Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and as a member of technical committee and the Secretariat Form for Supervision, Integration and Rehabilitation of Maoist Army Combatant. He is a visiting faculty at Tirubani University, Nepal Army Higher Command and Management Course, Army Command and Staff College, Institute for Crisis Management Studies, and APF Command and Staff College of Nepal. He has also participated at the DKI Asia Pacific Center for Strategy Studies, Hawaii Study of United States Institute on Foreign Policy, HMG Security and Justice course at University of Birmingham, and advanced level course on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration course of Transition International, the Netherlands. Dr. Deepak Bhatt, over to you.
Thank you, Sarosh. Thank you for your kind introduction. Professor Salvatore Babones and all participants, thank you, NICE, for providing this opportunity. And thank you, Professor, joining from Australia. And basically, as you agreed to talk about India and the US, the role of two democracies, and where we see from Nepal geopolitically this changing paradigm, and the democracies around the world are delivering, or there are questions regarding the populism and the authoritarianism, all these things. And first, I will introduce Professor Salvatore, as he has been working as a sociologist. He's associate professor of the University of Sydney. His research focuses on the political economy of the Indo-Pacific region and middle-income countries. He is also a visiting associate professor at Nanyang Technological University, NTU at Singapore, and visiting scholar at Academia Sinica in Taipei since 2015. Previously, he was a professor of sociology at University of Pittsburgh and was associated with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and the Russian International Affairs Council in Moscow, the Latvian International Affairs Council in Riga, and the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney. Professor Babones holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, 2003. He's the author of several books: Australia's Universities, Can They Reform, 2021, The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts, 2018, which has global attention, and American Tianxia, which is like, he can explain how Tianxia, the term is a code, and the Chinese money, American power, and the end of history, 2017. In addition, he has contributed many book chapters, journals, magazines, newspapers, and conference and research papers. So Professor Babones, please focus on your topic. You have 25 to 30 minutes, and after that we'll have Q&A. And as we see, as you are talking about the new kind of authoritarianism, and these references, as you focused on the India and the US, and where Trump and Modi have been signaling that how majoritarian democracies in the plural societies can work and deliver. And in terms of political economic or the economic indicators, you have been talking about the regular periodic elections held in India and in many countries, especially after the post-colonial era, have been showing the performing well. And intellectuals in India and out of India, or those who are talking about Indian democracy as more critical regarding your these statements. So how you look the process of new authoritarianism or these kind of things, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for attending. I really do appreciate it. My 2018 book, The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts. I'm very proud of the book. It's a short book. It's an easy read. It's only about 25,000 words, or less than 100 pages. But the book was named Best on Politics 2018 by the Wall Street Journal. Now, what I'm proud about is not the fact that it was named Best on Politics. What I'm most proud about is the fact that I wrote a book on Trump in 2018, and the reviewer said that he couldn't tell what my own political position was. And I think if you could write about Trump at the height of Trump madness in 2018 and no one can tell which side you're on, that must be some kind of accomplishment. And that feeds into what I'm going to talk about today, because I'd like to talk about this idea of the new authoritarianism. In the book, I highlighted the difference between the old authoritarianisms. The authoritarianisms we're familiar with, the authoritarianism, well, the original authoritarianism was that of the Antonio Salazar regime in Portugal. In fact, the word authoritarianism was first applied to politics with regard to the Portuguese regime of Salazar. Now, the Salazar regime in the 1920s and 30s was a non-partisan regime. It was a sort of democracy. There were elections in Portugal, but the entire establishment of the country, and primarily it was an alliance between the universities and the intellectual establishment, the military and the security establishment, and the Catholic Church and the ecclesiastical establishment in Portugal all agreed to support one person. And in fact, Salazar had no political party of his own. There were political parties in Portugal, but the Portuguese establishment agreed by consensus that they would support this one man to be the prime minister, regardless of him not having any kind of majority in parliament. Like I said, he didn't have a party at all. He was simply a university professor, an economist. However, the established institutions of society lined up behind him. And the word authoritarianism was applied to that, not because of the way he ruled, or like we now have this impression that authoritarianism means being very strict or being evil. But no, originally authoritarianism meant rule legitimated by authority. Why should Salazar rule? Because the major authorities in society, the established authorities, all lined up behind him. Okay. Now, there were other authoritarianisms in Europe. Poland had an authoritarian regime in the 1930s. Austria had an authoritarian regime. In fact, an authoritarian Catholic regime was in power in Bavaria at the time that Adolf Hitler, in the early 1920s, tried to stage a coup against the German government. Adolf Hitler's coup was, believe it or not, anti-authoritarian. That is, Adolf Hitler was terrible. He was a bad man. He was a totalitarian. He was a committer of genocide, but he was not an authoritarian. And one thing I want to remind people from a political sociology standpoint, from an analytical standpoint, is that words don't just mean good or bad. Like, it's not that an authoritarian is bad and a totalitarian is even worse. Authoritarian is one thing, totalitarian is another thing. In fact, Sweden, under the Social Democrats in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, has been called an authoritarian regime. Not because it was evil, they were good people doing good things, but they ruled on the basis of the authority of the major institutions in Sweden, not on the basis of achieving a parliamentary majority in a competitive electoral system. Okay. That's what authoritarianism is about. It's about rule with the support of the major institutions in society. From that standpoint, two people who've routinely been called authoritarians, Narendra Modi in India and the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, are anything but authoritarian. They may be maverick, they may be radical. You could even call them autocratic. So Narendra Modi is often accused of being an autocrat, meaning that he's taking decisions by himself. There are a lot of debate about that. Many people on the BJP side in India insist that Modi is, in fact, very much a consensus-driven person. His critics say, no, he's very autocratic. I don't know the truth of that situation. What I do know is that Narendra Modi is not an authoritarian. How do I know that? Because the major establishment institutions of Indian society, the system, as their critics like to call them, have been thoroughly opposed to the BJP and more lately Narendra Modi, really for the last 80 years, ever since the independence movement in India. The BJP has been regularly, I think 3 times now, it has been banned as an organization. BJP leaders have been put in jail. BJP intellectuals have been marginalized, have been unable to get positions at major universities. There has been no confluence or take-up between the army and the BJP. So there's never been a military coup in India where the military installed a BJP leader. The BJP has been an outsider party appealing to people over the heads of the major authorities in Indian society, in much the same way as Donald Trump appealed in 2016. He appealed to the American people over the heads, first of all, of the Republican Party. The entire Republican Party in the 2016 primaries was, as a body, opposed to the Donald Trump candidacy. And then when he won the primary, many establishment Republicans even campaigned against him. Of course, the major institutions of American society all condemned Donald Trump. The major newspapers in America, the universities in America. As we saw in 2020, even the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2020 were unsupportive of Donald Trump, trying to ensure that the military would not be sympathetic to Donald Trump. And so we had a very concerted effort on the part of the American establishment, the FBI, I mean, the list goes on, the tech giants, all being opposed to this leader. Now, again, you could call Donald Trump autocratic. You could call him dictatorial. You could call him lots of bad words, erratic. You could call him insufficiently qualified. You could call him uncouth and not presidential in his demeanor. All of those things are accurate. But to call him authoritarian is to mistake the meaning of the word authoritarian. As I said in my 2018 book, you can't be an authoritarian when the only authority you respect is yourself. Okay, so neither Modi nor Trump are classic authoritarians. But I did identify in that book the idea of a new authoritarianism, that is a new liberal authoritarianism of the liberal establishment in Western societies. And in the book, I didn't talk about India at all, but I did talk about Western societies in the US, UK, and Western Europe. The liberal establishment attempting to rule on its own authority. That is, insisting that what legitimates rule is not the result at the ballot box. What legitimates a government is not that the people voted for it. What legitimates government is that the major institutions support it. And that new form of authoritarianism is actually very prevalent in the political science profession, where we see new theories of democracy emerging, in which democracy has been redefined as a consensus among the leading institutions of society, instead of democracy being defined in the traditional way as one person, one vote. and whoever the people vote for gets to govern. That's the old-fashioned core meaning of democracy ever since ancient Athens right up until now. I think that this new authoritarianism has arisen because we have such a valence in our language that authoritarian is bad and democracy is good. As a result, even the authoritarians, even the people I call the new authoritarians, want to call themselves Democrats. Now, that's very different from the ancient world. If you go back to Aristotle and Plato, Aristotle was very happy to be anti-democratic. Aristotle actually called democracy a quote unquote degenerate form of government. Democracy is what happens when good governance goes bad and people just vote for who they want. So Aristotle thought democracy was a bad form of government. Plato thought democracy was a bad form of government. Plato thought that the ideal republic would be led by a group of guardians, unelected people, intellectuals, who perpetuated their own class so the children of guardians would themselves become guardians. And that occasionally, if someone very talented from the outside remainder of society showed a lot of promise, that person should be brought into the guardian class. What Plato described in his Republic as his ideal republic is strikingly similar to what many intellectuals want for the governance of our democracies today. Unless that seemed like too much of a stretch to you, let me put to you the actual concrete example that's been in the news literally today, yesterday was in the news, of the Indian Supreme Court. Now, the Indian Supreme Court, many of you are probably aware, appoints judges on a collegium system. That is, the Supreme Court itself nominates people who it thinks are worthy of joining the collegium and worthy of becoming judges in India. Now, there's nothing in the Indian Constitution that says that's so. In fact, the Indian Constitution says that the government will appoint judges with the advice of the court. But the Supreme Court itself struck down, again, under its own self-appointed authority, it struck down a constitutional amendment that would have explicitly had political appointment of judges. That is the government of the day appointing judges. Now, that may be good or bad. I mean, I tell people, I don't know for a fact that a politically appointed judiciary would be a better judiciary. It may be the fact that a self-perpetuating guardian class of judges who decide who will be admitted into their guardianship along with them, it may be that that kind of group will produce better judicial decisions. I don't know. I take no position on that. But if judges are a self-perpetuating guardian class, that's clearly not very democratic. Now, we might argue that judicial decisions are an area where we don't want democracy. We don't want people voting for judges. And I'd be willing to argue that. Many American states have elected judges. I think the system of elected judges works very well, but we all have differences of opinion. Nonetheless, whatever you're feeling about having unelected judges, about having an unelected central bank, about having unelected authorities deciding what's best for society, that may produce better technocratic governance in particular cases. Again, I don't want to have the debate, is it better? I simply want to ask people to decide for themselves, is that more democratic? Now, most of my political science colleagues would say yes. I think the answer is clearly not. Now, I want to contrast how intellectuals have reacted. This new authoritarianism I'm talking about, I want to contrast how intellectuals have reacted to two very similar events that have recently happened in two very different contexts. So in October, again, most of you are probably aware, if you're living in South Asia, you're probably aware that The Wire retracted two stories about government influence over online platforms. First, there was the tech fog story, the story that the BJP was using a proprietary software produced by a company that would allow it to suppress accounts it didn't like in the Indian media. And then there was the Meta, or Facebook story, how the government of India was simply sending emails to Meta saying, delete this account, suppress this account, with no judicial order, and Facebook was complying. Now, both of these stories turned out to be completely fabricated, entirely fabricated. Yet the liberal establishment has largely defended The Wire. One of the editors of The Wire was notoriously speaking just this week at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, on the role of the press in democracy in India, right? An invitation that probably went out before these stories were found to be fraudulent. The press has largely closed ranks, not the Indian press, the international press and international intelligentsia have largely closed ranks around The Wire. They've said that, well, The Wire was a victim of a fraudulent journalist, and the Wire couldn't know that these stories were wrong. Now, of course, The Wire knew very well the stories were wrong. In fact, in the Meta case, Facebook kept sending emails to The Wire saying, no, these emails are fraudulent. These aren't real. Here's the evidence that they're not real. It took them a long time for Wire to give up the story because it was such a good story that they wanted to be true. Okay. Let me contrast that with what's just happened the last week. Elon Musk, of course, as you all know, bought Twitter. And he started releasing the internal documents of the Twitter files, as he calls them, from the suppression of accounts during the 2020 US election campaign. He's done this through the journalist Matt Taibbi. Now, for those of you who don't know Matt Taibbi is a radical progressive journalist. He's most famous for calling Goldman Sachs, the big investment bank, during the 2008 financial crisis. He called Goldman Sachs a giant vampire squid sucking the life out of the American economy. So this is a very progressive journalist. Matt Taibbi wrote for Rolling Stone magazine. He now writes for Substack. He's certainly not a Trump type of journalist. But Elon Musk gave Matt Taibbi access to Twitter internal documents. What he found was that in 2020, the Democratic National Committee and the Biden campaign were literally sending emails to contacts at Twitter saying, please suppress these 20 accounts. Please suppress these tweets. And Twitter staff were simply actioning it. What's more, the Hunter Biden laptop story, the biggest story of 2020. Again, all of you have heard of the Hunter Biden laptop, the salacious details about it. The Hunter Biden laptop story was entirely suppressed by Twitter at the request of the Biden campaign. It went so far, according to Taibbi's reporting, it went so far that you weren't even allowed to share the story in a private direct message. So all of you are probably aware, many of you probably have WeChat accounts. You know how in China, if you send a message on WeChat saying, down with the dictator Xi Jinping, that chat you send on WeChat will simply be disappeared. Right? It won't be allowed to be delivered. It'll just be scrubbed from the system. Twitter was using tools that it developed to combat child pornography, because you have to have this ability. You can't allow people to share child pornography in your direct messages. So they had this tool they developed to suppress child pornography, and they labeled links to the Hunter Biden's laptop story as being the equivalent of child pornography. So you couldn't even send the link in a private communication between people. Okay, that's extreme. I mean, we've never seen anything like that in America. Now, that is America's tech fog. There's simply no doubt about it. I mean, the Twitter files are America's tech fog. The stories are incredibly parallel. The only difference being the tech fog story was fraudulent. The Twitter file story is true. Yet the entire US establishment media, New York Times, Washington Post, even the Wall Street Journal, have not reported on it or have only reported on it dismissively to say that there's no real story here. NPR, the National Public Radio, they're not reporting on it. CNN ran a brief report, 2 minutes, just saying that it happened. But all in general, the US media have acted together simply to ignore this story. Now, why is the world's liberal intellectual class, why did they love the tech fog story? Give it awards, invite journalists to present at prominent conferences on the basis of the tech fog story. Yet when the Twitter files comes out, the same story, it is being met with a stone wall of repression. Okay, I think the answer is obvious, that the global intellectual class are using their positions to further their own political views. It's no secret. I mean, I've said repeatedly on Indian media that Indian intellectuals are anti-Modi. And I've been shocked at people pushing back at that and saying, no, they're not. Look at this intellectual who likes Modi or that. And they're always pointing at people who do not have positions at universities, who are not editors of major newspapers, people who are outsider intellectuals. And that's the whole point. Yes, many outsider intellectuals support Narendra Modi. Many BJP supporters write books. That's fine. But they're not the president of the Indian Political Science Association. They're not the chairman of the newspaper guild. The establishment intellectuals, the credentialed intellectuals whose job it is to be an intellectual in India are, in general, thoroughly anti-Modi, and they use their positions to vilify Narendra Modi. Now, I want to be clear, their vilification may be correct. I'm not commenting here on whether the criticisms of Narendra Modi are correct or incorrect. I'm simply pointing out that the intellectual establishment uses its position to as much as possible present Narendra Modi in a negative light. In the same way that the US political establishment and intellectual establishment used its position as much as possible to present Donald Trump in a negative light. One of the remarkable revelations about the Twitter files that Matt Taibbi brought out is that political donations at Twitter, major tech platform, were 99.3% in favor of Democratic candidates. Over 99% of all political donations made by Twitter staff members went to Democrats. Now, that's remarkable. Now, we know that for Twitter. We also know that for university professors, it's over 95%. We have these statistics because in the US, political donations actually are registered, they're reported publicly, and so we have a database of them. Okay. So we can see this in the US, but the same kind of statistics are true for India. Now, the result is that Indian democracy has been rated poorly during the Modi era by all of the major international rankings organizations. This is something I've been talking about for the last few months about India. It's also happened to US democracy. That is, if I look at the trajectory of US democracy rankings, it was very high until George W. Bush became president, and then US democracy mysteriously dipped in quality. Barack Obama was elected, US democracy rose in its evaluations. Donald Trump was elected, US democracy fell again, and now that Joe Biden has been elected, the appraisals of American democracy has risen. Now, it's the same American democracy all throughout. The difference is, do you like the president, not do you like democracy? In India, it's been the same story, although much more extreme for Narendra Modi. So let me give you some quotes about Indian democracy coming from these democracy rating organizations. The Economist says that India is a flawed democracy, worse than South Africa. Now, South Africa is going through a crisis right now as its president refuses to step down. It's a violent, corrupt, one-party state. Yes, in some ways, there is a inspiring transition to majority rule in South Africa, but that's been a while ago now. South African democracy is in really poor state. I don't think you could say it's in better state than India's. Freedom House says India is only a partially free country. Variety of Democracy Institute, the most important of the three, rates India an electoral democracy just 2 steps in the international rankings above Myanmar. Myanmar, a country where a military junta overthrew the civilian government in 2021. Yet in 2022, Rise of Democracy Institute said that Myanmar and India were at the same level of democracy. Okay, I can go on and on with these statistics. The Press Freedom Index from Reporters Sans Frontières rates press freedom in India below that in Hong Kong. The Societal Hostility Index about freedom of religion coming from Pew Research Center rates India as the worst country in the world for hostility to religion. Worst in the world. Now again, I'm not a practicing religious person. I'm not living in India. I don't know what kind of pressures may be brought to bear about people, especially people practicing minority religions, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, any of the other religions of India. But worst in the world? Worse than China? Worse than Saudi Arabia and Iran? I find that very hard to believe. Okay. in general, these international rankings are very negative about Indian democracy only since 2014, and especially since 2019. And they're based on panels. That is, these indices are not created by experts who sit down and analyze the advice. Most of these indices, in particular, the most important one, the Rise of Democracy Institute Index, are based on questionnaires that are sent to leading intellectuals in the country. So Rise of Democracy Institute surveys, they say around 6 to 8, but for India, it may be more like 8 to 10 because India is a large country. But they survey somewhere probably around 8 to 10 university professors. VDEM, Rise of Democracy, short is VDEM, says that 85% of its respondents to its surveys are university professors, and they say that 2/3 of its respondents are people inside the country. In other words, VDEM is asking professors of politics, professors of political sociology, how would you rate India's democracy? And it's giving it a list of very detailed survey of items to list it on. And those intellectuals in India, primarily in India, or people who study India. And I want to be clear, I don't study India, I study rankings, right? So I would not be in the VDEM survey. India specialists will be in the India survey. They rank India's democracy as only the 101st best democracy in the world. Okay. That to me is an extremely unlikely representation of reality. And the representation of India from 10 years ago, that India was around the 50th best democracy in the world, even that I could argue might be biased or too low, but I could believe it. As bad as Myanmar, I certainly can't believe. But I want to stress these rankings are being conducted on the basis of the opinions of Indian intellectuals themselves. It is the intellectual class, the people who have an authoritative understanding of democracy. I mean, who understands democracy better than university professors who study their own country's democracy? These are the people ranking India at such a low level. But I suspect if we were to see a change in government in 2024, it's unlikely, I know, but things change fast in politics, and we were to see Congress or the Aam Aadmi Party miraculously win the election in 2024 and come into government, I suspect suddenly India's democracy will rise 40 places. Not because Indian democracy changed, but because the people rating Indian democracy suddenly liked the people in power. Now, I could give you all sorts of statistics about the mendacity of the rankings. The rankings do present evidence of the problems in the democracy in the country, but that evidence is so warped as to be reasonably characterized as simply lies, certainly misrepresentations. I mean, I'll give you just one example. My favorite example, because it's so easy to see. I mean, anyone can see the problems with it. India has been cited regularly as being the country where more journalists are killed than any country in the world outside China. More journalists are killed in India than any country outside China. And that is true. More journalists are killed in India than in any country outside China. How many journalists? Well, if we put it in numeric terms, I think the number was it 8 or 10? I forget the number. It was larger than any country outside China. But India also has more people with black hair than any country outside China, more people with right hands than any country outside China, more people with liver complaints than any country outside China. What is the rate of journalist deaths per billion people? That's what we would really want to know. What is the rate? It is in India, 3.5 journalists per billion people. Rest of world, 6.4. In other words, journalists are actually safer in India than they are in the rest of the world, despite the fact that India is a relatively poor country with a high level of communal violence, with lots of problems in rural India. Nonetheless, journalists are safer in India than in the rest of the world on a per capita basis. But you would never know that from reading the rankings. Right? So that's not the only mendacious figure. It's just the easiest one to understand. I could give you lots of other examples. They're in my paper. I'll give you just one more example. The the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act in India, again, is cited in each of the rankings as being evidence. Its weaponization against opposition figures is being used as evidence of the deterioration of Indian democracy. The citation given for that is a footnote to a 2016 report from Human Rights Watch. Well, you might say, well, okay, Modi came to power in 2014. And in 2016, Human Rights Watch published a paper saying that UAPA was being mobilized against opposition figures. Sounds pretty damning. Until you go read the report. If you go read the report is based on examples from 2002, 2012, and 2013. So all of the examples given in this damning report of opposition figures being wrongly imprisoned under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, wrongly or not, we could debate, but the claim that they're being wrongly imprisoned, all dated from the era of the previous government. So how can that data be used to support the accusation that Indian democracy has deteriorated under Narendra Modi? Now, obviously, it can't be used for that purpose. Why is it used for that purpose? I think it's clear. The reason it's being used for that purpose is that there's an opportunity to stigmatize the Modi government. Now, again, I want to be clear in all of this. I'm not Indian. I'm not Hindu. I'm not a Trump voter. I have no horse. I mean, I am an American. I do have some horse in the American race. But when it comes to India, I have no horse in this race. I have, if some of you follow my Twitter, you'll see that I put out a joking video, but one offering election advice to Rahul Gandhi, because I said, look, if Rahul Gandhi wants my advice, I'm happy to give it. You know, I'd love to see Rahul Gandhi do well. I have nothing against anyone in India. What I'm observing is I am not trying to take a position on Indian politics. I'm not trying to say one side is better than the other. What I'm observing is that there's a deep continuity of institutions in India. The institutions have not really changed fundamentally in India. Yet the evaluation of Indian democracy has been seriously downgraded by an intellectual class who are upset that they're not being listened to. I think it's the petulant anger of an establishment, an authoritarian establishment, that would like to see its authority over society resumed, but has no way to reestablish that authority. Look, we've seen it in both countries. Most intellectuals simply don't accept that it's legitimate to support Donald Trump. Donald Trump's announced he's running for election again. It's his business. I mean, every American has the right to run for president if he or she wants to. Donald Trump's running for president. If people stigmatize Donald Trump, I have no problem with that. The man has a lot of serious moral failures. But in a democracy, you can't stigmatize the voters. And that's the problem. We had Barack Obama saying that the people who vote for Donald Trump cling to guns or religion. He actually said that about Bush voters, but he then reiterated it for Trump voters. Poor people who cling to guns and religion instead of going out and improving their lives. Hillary Clinton called them a basket of deplorables. It was that comment that probably lost her the 2016 election. More recently, since January 2021, Trump supporters have been labeled as insurrectionists. Joe Biden, in this bizarre speech in front of a very militaristic-looking background with red drapes and Marines standing behind him, essentially said that people who vote for Trump are fascists. He didn't say it in exactly those words, but his words were carefully calibrated to imply that if you vote for Trump, you have a moral failing. Now, why are they stigmatizing people? I mean, are they stigmatizing people just because they vote for people they don't like? I think that's part of it. But I think they would rather stigmatize people than talk to them. I mean, in a democracy, we have to talk to each other. We have to live together. We all have to abide by the decisions we make collectively. But if you don't want to have to talk to your opponent, how can you justify not wanting to engage with this potential Trump voter? Well, call that person a racist, call that person a bigot, call that person a fascist, a Nazi, an authoritarian, and you can comfortably leave that person aside and not have to engage on the issues and not have to engage face-to-face with the person. It's the same in India. If you call someone a Hindutva fascist, well, you don't have to talk to that person. Why can you ignore that person? Because you wouldn't lower yourself to talk to Hindutva fascists. Conservatives, yes. I mean, you would talk to a conservative, but not a Hindutva fascist. It's the same sort of mechanism, stigmatizing people so you can ignore them. Unfortunately for the liberal establishment, that's not how democracy works. In a democracy, everyone gets to vote. I mean, literally, even fascists get to vote. In America, even racists get to vote. You can stigmatize them all you want, but you can't prohibit them from voting just because they're racist, fascist, homophobes, you name it.
Salvatore,
yes.
Sorry for interruption. Can you wrap up within 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, so, that's about how long I have. Yeah. So sorry, I was originally told a 45-minute speech, so I've already cut a bit out, but I will start wrapping in a minute.
No problem. We can take 5 minutes.
So this is not how democracy works. I want to end with a quote. And this is a quote from Winston Churchill. Now, I know Winston Churchill's not popular everywhere. He's very popular in America. He's unpopular in India. I have no idea how Nepalese feel about Winston Churchill. But speaking in the House of Commons in 1947, he made that famous speech in which he said, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Intellectuals love to cite that quote from Churchill. They titter a little, it's funny. Yeah, none of us really believe in democracy, but there's nothing better, so we have to stick with democracy. But that is to misquote Churchill. It's to intentionally misquote Churchill, because Churchill said, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But," and everyone leaves off the but there is the broad feeling in our country that the people should rule, continuously rule, and that public opinion expressed by all constitutional means should shape, guide, and control the actions of ministers who are their servants and not their masters. In other words, Churchill wasn't saying, well, democracy is not that great, but we have to live with it. Churchill was saying that, no. In our country, he meant the United Kingdom, but I would say it in America, in India, in Nepal, in every democratic country. In our country, the people rule, not the establishment, not the politicians, certainly not the government ministers. The people rule. The people make the decisions. Now, Mr. Modi is probably no fan of Winston Churchill. After all, the Bengal famine and the anti-Hindu racism that Churchill had, all the terrible things he said about Gandhi and all of that. But if Mr. Modi has been very successful, it's not because of Hindutva politics. It's not because of caste politics. It's not economic management. I mean, there've been a lot. I mean, the whole demonetization exercise was, everyone tells me, a disaster. There are all these problems of management in India. However, Narendra Modi understands, and all of his critics agree with this. Narendra Modi understands that he is not the master of India. He understands that he is the servant of India. It's very difficult to beat a politician who so visibly and ostentatiously works so hard for the people, not to force his own agenda on the people, who simply works so hard to implement it. Now, if intellectuals want to be taken as seriously as a Narendra Modi, want to be taken as seriously as the rising star in India, Yogi Adityanath, they need to get up early, go talk to people, and go work for people. If they do that, then they might change their attitudes. I mean, if the typical intellectual, instead of just like me giving a lecture on Zoom, were to get out there, work with ordinary people, talk to ordinary people, show respect to ordinary people, then I think they themselves would learn a lot, and they'd be much more likely, if they give respect to ordinary people, to receive that respect in return. All right. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor. Salvatore, as you have covered a wide range of how these democracies are working, and especially when talking about the Indian democracy and American democracy, the two different political systems in terms of serving to the nation or the people. And then you have categorically make a distinction between the old kind of authoritarianism and the new, what you mean to say about the new authoritarianism or the characteristics. And it comes when academia is talking about the politics and the individuals or the system is slightly, of course, based on some facts, as you mentioned, about the studies and the reports produced by the world-class institutions. And here is a question for you that the rise of nationalism in this particular era, as now we can see everywhere in the US or India or in China or in Nepal or around the world, along with populism. So the leaders, which are, I know, like while addressing the minorities in their own societies, Muslims in India or in Nepali case, we see that the other minorities like Malaysi people, and in China also, people are talking about the other than Hans. How?
Oh, you've silenced yourself.
God, yeah, it was mute.
Yes.
And how this, nationalism is structurally, dealing with minorities, and to some extent, we see how to handle with diversity is a difficult situation in India, and US is making its own way a diverse society. So, is how you see what kind of this nationalism
Sure.
or movement is threat to democracy, or is it will make it more healthier?
Nationalism may be a threat to democracy in Western Europe. Western Europe has its own problems with nationalism, and that's where nationalism originally came from. But the threat of populism in the US and India, I think, has been vastly overblown. Populist movements don't tend to enact particular policies. Populist movements instead tend to overthrow existing elites. And I think that's what makes elites so uncomfortable with populism. The reason they're so uncomfortable with Trump is not his policies. Trump's policies in office were pretty ordinary for a Republican in office. Modi's policies in India have not been remarkably different from the policies of previous governments. What people are afraid of is losing their authority in society. Now, intellectuals always want to speak on behalf of minorities. That's something that we see as a phenomenon going back even to the British Liberal Party speaking for Irish minorities in the 1840s. We can see this phenomenon arising. But I'm not sure that minorities need political parties to speak for them. So I've heard a lot about vilification of Muslims in India, yet Narendra Modi's approval rating among Muslims is well over 50%, yet 20% of Indian Muslims actually vote for the BJP. Well, if the BJP were systematically stigmatizing Muslims, again, I don't know. I don't have, I'm not Muslim. I'm not having that subjective experience, but I'm very wary of intellectuals warning me about this. Similarly, in the United States, Donald Trump was called a racist for being supposedly anti-Hispanic in the United States. Yet in southern border regions, so in Florida and in Texas, which have very heavy Hispanic populations, we've found that Donald Trump has been very popular among Hispanics, winning not a majority of the Hispanic vote, but winning a higher proportion of the Hispanic vote than any previous Republican presidential candidate. So again, if Hispanics are voting for Donald Trump in record numbers, if Black men are voting for Donald Trump in record numbers, not Black women, but Black men are voting for Trump more than they voted for any previous Republican candidate. Can it really be true that Trump is a racist who's against Hispanics and against African Americans? Now, he may be, I can't say. What I can say is that the evidence that populists like Modi and Trump have got into office by stigmatizing minorities, the evidence is very thin. And it's very self-serving for the intellectuals who want to use that evidence.
Thank you, Professor Salvatore. We don't have much questions in our chat box, but as you, though I haven't get a chance to read your book, any, but some articles, and I have get a chance to hear you in interviews or in the programs as you are talking about. So what is the difference about authoritarianism of Putin or Xi Jinping, and then compare it to Modi and of course the Trump, or I mean not the Biden.
Sure. Look, Vladimir Putin is a classic authoritarian. He shares all the attributes. You can go down the list, all the attributes of Antonio Salazar. He's a non-party politician. That is, he now has a party that supports him, but the United Russia Party is simply all the other previously existing parties have now united to become the pro-Putin party. But he did not run on a party platform. So he was a non-partisan pick endorsed by the country's elite. Now, the country's elite that endorsed him in the early 2000s were the oligarchs, who've now come to regret it, some of them, but the oligarchs, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the security services. The same kind of coalition that supported Salazar in Portugal. So Putin is a classic authoritarian. So, by the way, is Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. He's a classic authoritarian. These are not new authoritarians. The new authoritarians of the liberal the American liberal class, or the liberal elite in the US and other democratic countries, that's a very different form of authoritarianism. But Putin, Erdogan, Hungary's Viktor Orban, in many ways, is a classic authoritarian, though Orban does have a political party. He is different in that regard. Xi Jinping's not an authoritarian at all. I mean, again, I want to remind people, words, you can't just think that a word is bad, and because it's bad, everyone you don't like is that word. Okay. Xi Jinping in China is an absolute totalitarian regime. There's simply no two ways about it. It, again, fits all the criteria of a classic totalitarian regime. Single party rule, where that single party has control over all the levers of society, no independent civil society whatsoever, the police state, all of the characteristics of a classic totalitarianism, whether that's Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy. All of these totalitarian states share attributes with Xi Jinping's China. Now, people might add, and also genocide, because China's committing genocide in Western China. Committing genocide is not a particular feature of totalitarians. And again, not all bad things are the same bad thing. So when Hutus committed genocide against Tutsis in Rwanda, that wasn't a totalitarian regime, but it was still a genocide. When Turkey committed the Armenian genocide in the 1920s, that wasn't a totalitarian regime. It was still a genocide, right? So these concepts, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, genocide, they're all bad things, but they're all different bad things. Sorry, you're still on mute. You're on mute is the word of the year for 2021.
Yeah. Sometimes it is having a very minor problem. Thank you, Professor Salvatore. I think I will, there's one more question popped up. What role do you think non-resident Indian in USA have played or playing to strengthen the
the ties, between the two democracies.
Ties. I think it's like between two democratic countries. And what should Nepali diaspora learn? I mean, it's for all the countries, the diaspora, how it is contributing to this.
The diaspora in the US, and particularly here in Australia, where I live, the Indian diaspora has been mainly active in business ties, so creating business links between the countries, not so much in fostering civil society or political cooperation. Now, that's starting to change. There's an increasing level of organization among the Indian diaspora, especially in the US, but it's still at a very nascent phase. It doesn't have the same sort of high level of mobilization as, for example, the Jewish diaspora with regard to support for Israel, or even in some cases, diasporas of smaller countries that may have a very strong particular interest in their country. The Indian diaspora clearly, to use the English phrase, punches below its weight in terms of it's an enormous size, an enormous level of prosperity, but it doesn't have that much influence over policy. It's mainly been interested in business links. What can Nepal learn from that? I don't know. Nepal's diaspora is very different. It's a much poorer diaspora. So for Indians, the Indian diaspora is the Indian diaspora in the West is mostly made up of high-income professionals in the diaspora. Of course, there's a major Indian diaspora in the Persian Gulf, which is made up of very poor Indians who work in the Persian Gulf. That's a very different phenomenon. The Nepalese diaspora in the West tends not to be, generally speaking, composed of high-income professionals. So I'm not sure that there's the same opportunity for them to get involved in promoting investment and promoting business links. But that would, I expect, be the first sort of, the first step up the chain of diaspora involvement would probably be in promoting investment.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Salvatore. I think we have had a very interesting session here, and while comparing these two democracies, India and US, and not only focusing on the individuals, but how the old authoritarianism and the new one is coming, and how academia and the research institutions and all their analyzing these changes. And somewhere, Professor, you mentioned about the intellectuals in India are less, or somewhere they're less pro-Indian in terms of talking about the Modi's cult, how he's delivering, how he has become the single person in that position, because we have seen that now social media and the different forms of media are intervening from every corner of the world, and it was not the same during before 90s when Indira Gandhi was, or some other prime ministers were, or some the other presidents were serving before 90 or the early 90s. So compared to this particular form of globalization or interlinked world, do you see that the Indian intellectuals are intervening in that biased way?
Look, Indian intellectuals, the Indian intellectual establishment, what right-wing Indians like to call the system in India, very much arises out of what we sociologists call a comprador elite. That is, the comprador elite in developing countries are those people who speak the colonial languages fluently, in India's case, English, and whose families, or if not their particular families, the institutions in which they're embedded, made their fortunes originally by articulating between colonial powers and the local environment. Okay. So they come out of this milieu of the comprador elite, as opposed to, say, the pro-BJP intellectuals, the outsider intellectuals in India, who very much arise out of the national elite. That is, people who were local in the country. And by the way, I don't need national. I know in India, people use national as a compliment, right? So the national elite sounds like it's the good guys, the comprador are the bad guys. There's no implication like that whatsoever. It's simply how they made their money. The founders of the BJP were mainly prosperous Brahmin business people in Gujarat and in Northwest India who made their money locally, as opposed to the founders of Congress. And the main backers of Congress were people like barristers, right? The Nehrus and Gandhis, who were barristers who were trained in London and who had a role to play connecting global institutions to local ones. So the elites have these two different origins. And in many societies, especially in Africa, we see the same kind of distinction between a local elite or a national elite and a comprador elite who are competing for power. So there's nothing distinctive about India in that. What's happened in India that has been distinctive is that over time, as India has remained a democracy, that group coming out of the national elite has become more and more politically powerful. So that now there's a situation in India where the group associated with the national elite, the RSS and the BJP, have actually won political power away from the group associated with the comprador elite, the Congress Party. And that comprador elite is now almost fading into political obscurity. I mean, Congress is disappearing and nobody is replacing it. There's a lot of talk about the Aam Aadmi Party replacing it, and maybe it will. If it does, I think it's very noteworthy that the Aam Aadmi Party is another national party. I mean, its main core constituency is civil servants and professionals, but they are not people who have strong articulations to the outside Western world. They're people who are strongly rooted in Indian society. So if I were to look forward to what will Indian politics look like in 20, 30 years, whether it's the AAP or some other party, it will be a different locally rooted party that challenges the BJP, and probably in a two-party system that goes back and forth, while cutting out that old comprador elite entirely out of the political process.
So for your contribution, and thank you all participants, and thank you NICE for providing, this opportunity, sharing the session with Professor Salvatore Babones, and definitely we will be in communication and we'll be organizing some more, not even not at just series, but on occasional issue, different occasions. So thank you for your comprehensive presentation, and how these democracies are performing, how intellectuals are intervening and looking at the society, and what changes are there in terms of institutions and individuals. Yes, we have seen that in Gujarat today. The results is coming out of the recent provincial elections, that we have seen that in the 5th consecutive terms they are coming with the overwhelming majority. So again, thank you, NICE, and thank you, Sarosh. Over to you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks a lot for the interesting discussion. We were really honored by your presence today. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience immensely benefited from it. Professor Salvatore Babones, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in Kathmandu in future. Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt, thank you for sharing this session. We would also like to thank all our audience for their wonderful questions. Thank you so much.